This is the next topic that we're going to study. It is called negative space. So, this is a really informative way to start thinking about art and design and just the visual world. So, although it may be kind of challenging to understand at first, um, we're going to just go ahead and dive in and I'll try to break it down for you on understanding this topic. So, one great example of when we may think about negative space may be something like this. This is the Rubens base illusion, which is when we are working with just black and white, a negative and a positive space, and you're either seeing two faces looking at each other with these moths, flying around these faces or heads, or we're seeing a vase with a bunch of moths flying out of it or in it, perhaps. So the Rubens vase illusion was a Rorschach test, but it's a really great example of how we can see different spaces. So negative space is defined as a space surrounding an object, not the object itself, but just the space around the object. And that's what makes this illusion so interesting. That's what makes our eye go back and forth because we are looking at two different types of spaces. So, negative space has traditionally been a tool in advertising, and it's been a tool that designers use to create a really striking image that can say a lot with using a little. I think that it also is something that really resonates for consumers in a way because it really makes a mark in a sense that it is kind of this unforgettable, really graphic image that we can look at. So, for example, this Coca Cola campaign features a bottle centered in the middle of the red that we associate with the Coca Cola label. And then on just the left and right, you have the fork and the knife, which frame perfectly the Coca Cola bottle, which with very minimal amount of visual information, we're able to get a whole sensation of having a delicious meal, being hungry, craving a Coca-Cola. And so it's just a great use. This negative space is a great use of creating something simple and impactful and striking and not easy to forget. We're going to be looking at this great example of this pair of scissors drawn in two different ways. So on the left, you can see that we have an example of the scissors being drawn of the positive space of the scissors, which is the actual subject. And then on the right-hand side, you can see that the negative space or the space surrounding the object has been drawn in, which inherently informs us of the actual pairs of scissors. So you can see that in the example on the right, even though the negative space is shaded around the scissors, we can still see the shape, but we don't see the details. We don't see the luster of the scissors, the rubber handle of the scissors, any texture or any visual information inside of that. So the way we're going to be working and thinking now is really similar to that silhouette drawing that we started on the first week of class, but we're just going to be focusing on the space around those silhouettes this time. A good example of an artist that has a really strong sense and good use of negative space in all of his works is the artist M.C. Escher. This is a piece of his right here. He was an artist who was really interested in the idea of infinity and would create these really magically realistic, highly rendered images of what felt like a kind of constant motion of infinity, as you can see with these tiny little alligators that are going in and out of this sort of coloring book. So I'm going to just highlight here the negative space in blue for you so you can see where MC Escher had used negative space here. So here's one little layout, and you can see that as we start laying out the negative space, we can notice that the negative space holds the positive subjects, right? The subjects in the middle in this way that can still very much kind of cradle and give us that type of movement and that type of rhythm within this image that keeps it really, really interesting and keeps your eye kind of always going around in this circle in the way that MC Escher probably wanted us to see that in that circular motion. And what's really interesting too is when you remove the positive space, you can see that what's left over, what remains, the highlighted negative space still has this really nice rhythmic balance around it. Our eyes are still flowing around. And so negative space is just meant for us to understand an object more fully. So when you're doing this drawing, you might be asking yourself, how do I go about, really looking at negative space? How do I draw negative space in something? So we're going to use this example of this Bernini sculpture of Apollo and Daphne. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to cite out the sculpture. So when you're doing your drawings, you want to cite first that tool that you already know how to do. So when citing out the sculpture, we're going to figure out how big Daphne's head is, and we're going to figure out how many heads tall is this sculpture. So that's like about 8 heads, 7.75 heads. And then we're going to start looking at the relationships between the two characters here. So we're going to look at the way that the cape falls over the shoulder, the space in between that, all the way over to Apollo's shoulder on the left there compared to Daphne's shoulder on the right, seeing how her shoulder comes above his. We're going to look at Apollo's heel and relationship to Daphne's heel, which one is coming higher, which one's coming lower. All of that citing, that tool that we know, we will start off with that. And then afterwards, then we'll start to really look at the negative space, and we can cite the negative space as well. So we can think, all right, so I see this negative space here on the left, the highlighted in blue on the left. I can see it comes up higher than the negative space that is highlighted in blue on the right. And then I can also see that the negative space there is a pocket or an island of negative space that comes below that. And I can see that there's some negative space in between their legs there, in both of the Apollo and Daphne. And so you will cite first, and then you will kind of find those islands of negative space secondarily or afterwards. So here's a good example of an artist who drew out and cited out a plant, and then afterwards filled in all of that negative space. You're going to be doing something pretty similar to that, but instead of drawing in the negative space like charcoal or a graphite pencil or something, you are going to use your ink. So after you outline the subject, you want to take ink and you want to ink your negative space. And then what's going to happen is you're going to end up with these beautiful, really high contrast, very lush black and white imagery. And one thing I can recommend is trying out maybe drawing some plants for this, because they always make really interesting examples of negative space with their very their beautiful organic shapes. Well, good luck with this and have fun with it, and I'm excited to see it.